Well, hello all, and thanks for joining us for the latest in our Brody's sessions on ESG. Today we're focusing on ESG in the energy sector, and I'm joined by my colleagues James Millward and Katie Love. Katie and James are both experts in the area of ESG and will be contributing some fantastic content today. We're conscious we are running this session right in the heart of the COP26 event happening in Glasgow. And in some ways, our starting point here is that a lot of the themes and issues which are driving COP26 forward are relevant to this session. So environmental, social and corporate governance in the energy sector. In recent years, we have seen an increased move around the world to corporate reporting, which relates to environmental, social and corporate governance performance. And that drive towards that type of corporate reporting really aligns very carefully and very closely with the same goals of climate change and preventing climate change that COP26 is grappling with in Glasgow right now. Certainly the energy sector for a number of years now has had the challenge of ESG and climate change at the heart of what it does. We did think it was interesting to look at one major investor in the sector, that's BlackRock, and to demonstrate where investors are here. So a quick quote from the CEO from BlackRock to get us going. So BlackRock have invested 255 billion in the sector. And the point is they're requiring ESG to be demonstrated right now. The CEO says, given the groundwork we've already laid, engaging on disclosure, and the growing investment risks surrounding sustainability, will be increasingly disposed to vote against management and board directors when companies are not making sufficient progress on sustainability related disclosures and the business practices and plans underlying them. So you have there a major investor expecting senior management in energy businesses to be taking ESG reported disclosures really seriously. So we want to give you some information today to help you and your organization to achieve that. At the same time, regulators around the world are really ramping up their activity on ESG now, and we're going to talk about, in particular, with the OGA's approach in the UK, but we'll also look at the international position as well. I think the safe thing to assume, although we're going to talk about a transition happening right now, the safe thing to assume is that as we move through this period, mandatory ESG reporting is going to become a requirement for all, albeit you'll hear from Katie later that it's been filtered in the energy sector at this stage. Okay, so with that background, let's start with a very quick 101 from James on ESG and what we mean by ESG. James, can I ask you to deal with that?
Well, good morning, everyone. Very nice to be here. So ESG is hopefully a very familiar banner. Covers environmental, social and corporate governance. Social and governance would cover areas such as community and workforce engagement, health and safety, as well as commitment by senior management, which we may take a look at a bit later on. But I think today, Paul, we're going to focus on the E, the environmental banner. And for the energy sector, of course, that's a hot topic and could cover areas like reducing carbon emissions, packaging, pollutants and contaminants, as well as monitoring and reducing pipeline leaks and generally reducing environmental releases. I think it's worth flagging that the G is the uniting factor on ESG. Really, ultimately, you can't have a comprehensive and effective ESG strategy without ensuring that you have good, strong, robust corporate governance, and that's necessarily going to involve management and board buy-in.
Great, thanks, James. And as we say, we really want to give everyone on the call some of the tools to help you deliver that commitment in your organisation today. So I said at the outset, we'll drill into the OGA in a second, but before we do that, because we're thinking about COP26, we're thinking about the global approach here. James, can you tell us a bit more about what are regulators, notable regulators in the energy sector around the world doing on ESG right now?
Well, it's an important point, I think, that we have a wide angle view to this, because as you say, it's not just the UK, there is worldwide pressure being put on companies to get to grips with ESG and to measure their performance against ESG metrics. There are a variety of bodies, Paul, around the world which are working to develop frameworks based on stakeholder input. I suppose the ones that I would highlight are the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC in Washington in the US, which is a very effective and traditionally a fairly aggressive enforcement regulator, and they've announced the creation of a climate and ESG task force in their enforcement division. That was announced earlier this year, I think. In North America and the US as well, there is the American Petroleum Institute, the API, and its members have developed an addition on sustainability reporting guidance for the oil and gas industry. This is designed to help shape the structure and content of sustainability reporting, so a useful resource for companies which are operating in the US. And then closer to home, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, originally, of course, a voluntary body, now really regarded as the key reporting framework for helping companies and other organizations disclose climate-related risks and opportunities.
Great, thanks, James. And for everyone on the call, for each of those regulators, much of the material demonstrating where they are, you'll find easily online, but please get in touch with either James or Katie or myself if you need pointed in the right direction there, particularly, for example, with API and how to access API materials. So then let's turn this back to the UK, Katie, and clearly the OGA, significant regulator for the energy sector here. We've heard about what's happening internationally. Tell us more about the OGA's approach to ESG and ESG reporting at the moment.
Thanks, Paul, and good morning, everyone. I think on this point, the first place to start is probably the OGA's revised strategy, and that was published earlier this year in February. And that revised strategy requires robust ESG compliance and reporting by relevant persons within the sector. So relevant persons being licensees, operators, and also owners of infrastructure. And within the strategy, there are two central overarching obligations that are placed on licensees, operators, owners. The first of those is to secure the maximum value of economically recoverable petroleum. So that might ring a bell in terms of MER UK. And the second central obligation is for licensees, operators, owners to take appropriate steps to assist the UK government in meeting the net zero target. And that includes reducing as far as reasonable greenhouse gas emissions from sources such as flaring and venting, and also power generation, and supporting the various CCS projects, so that's carbon capture and storage projects that are currently underway in the North Sea.
Great. So Katie, those two overarching obligations are like sort of objectives or goals, they're outcomes focused. Does the strategy have below that some more basic steps or more basic requirements to help you make the move towards those two overarching obligations?
Yes, it does. So the central obligations are obviously the two key ones, but they're complemented by 9 supporting obligations that cover a variety of things. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I think the most relevant for our purposes today and for ESG would be governance, asset stewardship, decommissioning, and also carbon capture, storage, CCS projects that I'd mentioned earlier.
Great. So we're definitely going to focus on a couple of those, Katie, in this session. I mean, as a group, we've constantly had a discussion around where does decommissioning sit alongside ESG performance, and we know that for the North Sea, certainly decommissioning is going to be a key part of the next chapter. So thinking about that, what does the supporting obligation that you've just mentioned, which deals with decommissioning, what does that require of businesses?
So it essentially requires that owners of infrastructure need to ensure and also be able to demonstrate, which I think is a key point, you've got to be able to demonstrate that all viable options for the infrastructure's continued use, including reuse or repurposing for CCS projects, have been suitably explored. And there's lots more detail within that obligation, but that's the key point.
Yeah, that's how the balance is trying to be struck. Okay, and then the other point again with COP26, we've got to look at that carbon capture and storage obligation. That has to be a key issue right now. So what is the strategy saying there on carbon capture and storage projects?
So it's saying that relevant persons, being the licensees, owners and operators that we discussed before, that where it's reasonable, or where there's a reasonable prospect of a project being developed, they should be having due regard to CCS projects when complying with their obligations under the strategy. So that includes specific things like collaborating with people and entities who are planning and carrying out CCS projects, as well as negotiating access to infrastructure for CCS projects, it says in a timely fashion and in good faith. And also it requires the permitting access to the relevant infrastructure to be used for CCS projects on it's called fair, reasonable and non-discriminatory terms. So I think collaboration is the key, or the buzzword for this one.
Yeah, great. So we've looked at the overarching obligations. We've started to drill into a couple of relevant supporting obligations there. To sort of close this review of the strategy, Katie, taking a step back, what are the key takeaways? Probably let's think about that from the perspective of operators and licensees in the first place. What are the key takeaways from this revised strategy the OGA have produced?
For owners and licensees and operators as well, what it means is that they're required to support the drive to net zero, and that's the crux of it. And these obligations apply as of now, and compliance is expected in a timely fashion, which is a very polite term used in the strategy. And I think that some of the practical steps and expectations are set out within the OGA's ESG Task Force report that I know we're going to touch on later. But I think, having looked at operators and licensees, it's important not to forget non-operators that are also playing a massive part in the sector. And for the non-ops who are looking to improve or build on ESG credentials and performance, I think the strategy should help them in these efforts by giving them potentially a louder voice within the OPCOM, certainly with the collaborative approach that's being pushed by the OGA. And if nothing else, I think it should be able to make them more satisfied that operators and licensees that they're working with are all driving towards the same point, being net zero.
Great. And I think you've already been giving advice to Katie, haven't you, to clients on the non-op side on that basis that you've got a much more promising platform to look for the operations side of a committee to perform in a way that's more aligned with ESG expectations and requirements. Yeah, great. Okay, so the task force, Katie mentioned it there, James, this ESG task force that the OGA have set up. Can you tell us a bit more about the work that it's doing and who it is?
Well, let's start with who it is then, Paul. So we're talking about task force within the OGA and a dedicated team which has been set up by the OGA to address ESG in the sector. It's already published a report on the E, entitled Defining the E of ESG Reporting, very imaginatively, published earlier this year. And in the immediate future, the task force is recommending that operators and licensees align to a common minimum standard of reporting using specific metrics which the task force has identified, and that they should be working to be ready to report against these metrics in Q1 2022, alongside the publication of their 2021 4-year audited financial reports, of course. So this is a message which is consistent with what we're seeing across many industry sectors.
Yeah, this is that recommendation to start the ESG reporting cycle now. And I think we'll talk later about the fact that for certain businesses that's more than a recommendation, but certainly for at the moment the task force's report is recommending that in the next reporting cycle. James, is that right?
That's right, and we're talking about this trajectory to get reporting on a consistent standard footing, which will increase transparency for all investors and stakeholders. Great.
In a minute, I do want to come back to that concept of the standard of reporting and the metrics we can use for that, because I think for everyone on the session today, that will be a helpful, practical discussion to have. Before we get to that, Katie, can we take that helicopter view of the task force report, this March 2021 report, and what are the key requirements for the sector that are coming out of the report?
Yeah, so the task force has highlighted some overarching expectations it has of those operating in the sector. And I think that's probably a good place to start. I'm going to flag from the outset that these all relate to climate-related data. And there's 4 that are helpful to look at. So the first is disclosure, and that's disclosure of climate-related data in financial reports, as well as on websites. We're seeing a lot of those operating in this sector having dedicated sustainability or ESG sections within their websites, which are really helpful sources of information. And I know James is going to pick up on that later. The second one is the recognition of data gaps. And I think this is quite an important one, given that a lot of people will still be at the start of their ESG journey, if we'll give it that name. But the task force is essentially encouraging the recognition of data gaps within organisations to ensure better transparency going forward. I think where we are just now is not all organisations will have all the data stored or at their fingertips, and that's fine, but there just needs to be a recognition of that. Third, there needs to be a signal planned improvements within disclosures. So I suppose it ties in with the recognition of data gaps. Companies are just expected to say, this is where we are now, and here's how we plan to improve on our ESG performance going forward. And finally, the 4th overarching expectation is a commitment by senior leadership to drive their business to gather accurate data to support robust ESG reporting.
Great. So Katie, I think that's really, really helpful overview, because the point here, and hopefully the audience are getting this loud and clear, the first step to achieving the ESG, I know we're focusing on E at the moment, but the first step here is to have the data available, or to be gathering the data, and therefore to be able to review the data and be credible about the claims and reports that you're making in connection with that data. That must be a key takeaway from everybody from today's calls. Do you have that already set up in your processes to capture or not? James, we'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment, I think, because I think it's really important to drill into that. Before we get to that, I almost want to touch on here, Katie, the fact we're saying the E of the ESG is what we're talking about right now. I think it's fair to say the task force is not yet really saying anything loud and clear about the social and corporate, well, that's harsh. It's yet to publish its guidance on what social and corporate governance elements of ESG will be. Can you let us know where they are on that? What's the time frame for the S and the G being spoken about?
Yeah, I think that's right, Paul. And I would flag, I say, James mentioned earlier that governance is kind of one of the overarching factors that come into it. So while there's still a governance aspect on the environmental section of ESG, I think it's quite right to say that this report isn't really focusing on the social and governance aspects. And that's fine for now. But what I would say is that the OGA's governance guidance is actually under consultation at the moment, with that process closing in a few weeks on the 12th of November. So if any of you on the call have feedback for that, it'd be worth going and having a look and putting in any comments. But the governance guidance, once it's agreed and published, will address the S and G aspects of ESG. And the guidance itself, once it's been through the consultation, it's approved, is expected to be published towards the end of this year. So we should have some more information available soon.
Great, thanks, Katie. So 12th November is a red letter day for everybody on the S and the G element, certainly. Now, James, I'm going to give you a tricky task here. We're going to turn back to what's in front of us right now from the task force, the focus on E, the focus on the environmental reporting side. We've talked about the importance of developing these common standards. So one of the things the task force has looked at are metrics, and what metrics can be used to measure the E performance and ESG. Now, the tricky thing for you here is I want you to spend a minute or so making a discussion about metrics interesting. Can you do that for us?
Well, do you want to give me marks out of 10 at the end of my 2 minutes?
I'll develop a metric. I'll develop a metric to assess the quality of your discussion of metrics. How about that?
Okay, all right. I hope it doesn't feed into my appraisal. So we're talking here, Paul, about qualitative and quantitative metrics, and the task force has divided these up into several different groups. If we look firstly at the tier 1 quantitative metrics, people on this call are going to be familiar with these. We're talking about health and safety statistics, air and water pollution risks, waste management and disposal, and carbon intensity, of course, which is probably the most topical of those four. And companies are already, I think, working to track and to report on the data which they have derived for many years, actually, in relation to these different groups via other initiatives. Many of our clients are already reporting, of course, on their health and safety statistics as they relate to illness, injury, and fatality. And they probably have quite a good pool of data stored up at any given time. So we're talking here really about how do they collect the data, how do they process that data, and how do they present it so that it's in compliance with with these metrics. From quantitative, I'm going to move very quickly into qualitative. Just one further thing to say, I think, is around targets of board oversight and governance, climate change risks and opportunities, and also that companies should be thinking about putting in place an action plan we'll be talking, I think, a bit about strategy later on, but an action plan to support a low emission economy. So that ties in with what Katie was saying about this overarching obligation, and a facility for describing targets and methods used to drive these investments in emissions reduction activities. There are also tier 2 and tier 3 metrics, which I don't propose to go into, but they cover both qualitative and quantitative metrics. I think from the work I've done, and you and I have done a lot of work in the oil and gas sector over the last year or 18 months in particular, that many companies in this sector already have these qualitative metrics in place at an internal level. But the challenge, as I touched on briefly just then, is the presentation of those metrics to make sure that they are appropriately presented externally and that they are fitted into the financial reports properly, so that they are in compliance with where the task force is going on this.
Yeah, so your point there is that we think the material exists largely in internal reporting already, and the job now is to transition that into something which is an appropriate external facing piece of work. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's completely correct. Now, before I move on to the next point I want to discuss with the team, just a quick flag. We've got a couple of questions already through, and we'll deal with those under the Q&A tab. But if any of you joining have a burning question on ESG or related issues within the sector, please do post that, and we'll come to that in the end. We've already got a couple of questions through, so thanks for those so far. So turning back to the discussion, I want to pivot a little bit towards, again, thinking about COP26 and net zero. So we've seen net zero targets being set by a lot of major economies. Indeed, even yesterday and today, we're seeing new targets on net zero being set by major economies. James, thinking about the OGA as a UK regulator, how does it reflect the UK government's commitment to net zero? Where do we see that in the OGA's work?
Well, I think we've seen through the discussion so far that the OGA is very much alive to the responsibilities on the sector at large to improve its environmental performance. And consistent with that, as part of that, it's launched its stewardship expectations. They were refreshed a couple of years ago. And in March this year, it added to those expectations a new one on net zero, at the same time, of course, as it was publishing the revised strategy and the task force report. The net zero expectation, just very briefly, requires the industry to measure, report and track its data relating to emissions reductions by implementing key performance indicators, metrics and targets, as we've discussed, that can be properly quantified, that are transparent. And in order to do this, I think it's expected that the quantification is going to look at the societal cost of greenhouse gas emissions. And so that must form a part of a company's corporate decision-making. What impact does its CO2 emissions have on the society it's operating in. And this is going to require strong corporate governance. This is a theme that we have been drawing on, I suppose, throughout this webinar, and that engages all three of the ESG limbs. So to answer your question, Paul, I may have strayed slightly away from the question, but to answer it in a nutshell, I think that we've seen that the OGA is pretty committed to supporting the net zero drive, and that flows from what the government is saying and the wider imperatives of society, and it's demonstrating increasing consistency across its guidance on environmental performance and ESG reporting.
Great, thanks, James. I'm very happy to mark you on your ability to stick to the question as well. We do that at the end if you've got some time, so that's great. Katie, just turning a little bit back to decommissioning, because we often talk about decommissioning and how that sits alongside what we're trying to achieve and what the energy sector is trying to achieve now with ESG. So can you talk to us about that? To what extent can what we anticipate in terms of decommissioning activity in the North Sea in this next period, to what extent can that align with ESG requirements?
Yeah, I think, as you said earlier, we're only going to see decommissioning activity increasing in the next 10 to 15 years. And I think on one view, there is a bit of a conflict between the desire to achieve net zero and the level of decommissioning that we're going to see, and all the inherent environmental risks that come along with that. And unfortunately are, while they can be mitigated, they are unavoidable in certain instances. And Stewardship Expectation 10 covers cost-effective decommissioning. And it requires operators to have a decommissioning strategy in place, which is of course covered by separate OGA guidance. But generally these need to be in line with the MER UK, which is the principal objective, or which has the principal objective of maximising the economic recovery of UK petroleum. So that's objective number 1 within the revised strategy, but doesn't really touch on objective number 2, and doesn't really have a specific net zero or ESG focus. But I think when you take the decommissioning strategy and the requirements around that and the revised strategy as a pair of documents rather than separate documents, the strategy does say that decommissioning activity has to be examining and addressing the potential for reuse or repurposing of facilities, and the potential for involvement in CCS projects. So I think when you take a broader view and you look at all the guidance around this, they should hopefully work together going forward.
Great. Okay, thanks, Katie. So what I want to do now is look at what's coming next. Now, I do want to ask you, I'll ask you, Katie, this question. I do want to ask you, what are we going to hear next from the OGA in terms of ESG reporting? But the other point I thought I'd flag at this stage is we've already had a number of questions through which are cutting to the chase of the mandatory reporting, when that's going to come in and what that will look like for the sector. So can you do those two things, Katie? Can you talk about what we're going to see next from the OGA in terms of ESG reporting, and can you also comment on when we're going to see mandatory reporting coming in for the sector?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the blunt answer for what's coming next, it'll be the governance guidance that's currently under consultation, and I think this almost answers both points because it focuses on 4 main things. The first one being the adoption and application of a recognised governance code that's suitable for the size and characteristics of the licensees that are operating in the sector. Second of all, it deals with the adoption and application of the OGA's strategy and the specific principles set out within that. So, one being the need to support the net zero target. Thirdly, and I think this is part of the answer to your question, Paul, and to the audience's questions, the third thing that it focuses on is the commitment to take appropriate steps to assist the UK government in meeting its net zero target and to align a common standard of climate reporting, and also to give due consideration to corporate social responsibilities. So the governance guidance will come with far more detail on what a reporting system is going to look like. And the final thing that the governance guidance is expected to focus on is how the OGA will actually monitor compliance with the proposed guidance, including requiring a broad account of how it's met and will continue to meet the objectives set out in the guidance. So we will know more in terms of timescales and how a reporting system will actually look once it's been agreed and published. But I think it's safe to say that, you know, with this anticipated by the end of this year, we've not got a huge amount of time to wait until mandatory reporting will be in place.
Yeah, so that's talking about the energy sector focused approach with the OGA and the guidance coming out in November and what comes after that. That all makes sense and clear to me. Become agnostic or become non-sector specific now, Katie, on this. So where are we in terms of right now with ESG disclosure requirements? Who is it mandatory for right now, and what's the UK government's broader plan, again, not energy specific, but broader plan for bringing in increased ESG disclosure requirements in the next period?
So as things stand, there's already mandatory reporting requirements in place on listed companies, and you know, that might capture actually some of those attending today. But for others who are UK registered companies, there's a general expectation, and actually we were discussing this earlier today, the greening finance document that's been produced by the Treasury, it sets a general expectation for UK registered companies. So that will capture, you know, across all sectors, it will capture anybody who's not within, you know, listed companies, financial services companies, or investment firms. And the picture that's currently being painted is that mandatory reporting within annual accounts will be required by, you know, 2024, 2025 at the latest. But there will also be significant mandatory reporting requirements in place by 2023. So I think that's the line in the sand.
Right. Really helpful to see that. Okay, now let's end or come to the end now with some practical discussion, because we've talked about what the regulator is doing. We've talked about the time frame for increased requirements coming in. So let's now turn to what are we saying right now to clients and others in the sector. What should they be doing right now? So James, take off your metrics hat, put on your practical advice and guidance hat. So I think we know from current experience that across the sector, different actors are at different stages in their ESG compliance journey, if I can use that language. So we know, and you can tell us a bit about what the more sophisticated or more advanced entities in the sector are doing, because it's already out there. But for those of us who are more at the beginning of the journey on ESG, if we're starting from now or have just started recently to look at this, what should those companies be doing?
Well, Katie touched on it, Paul, in answering your previous question. Premium listed companies are already complying with a huge set of disclosure requirements under ESG, and that requirement is being extended increasingly to the regulated sector. But if you look at the FTSE 100 and you look at the FTSE 250, the big companies in the sector have produced an enormous amount of material and disclosure around ESG. They have dedicated pages on their websites to their ESG performance, the initiatives and their achievements. And I suppose that is a very good starting place for the small and medium-sized enterprises that we encounter in our day jobs. It's a huge repository of relevant material. It's good instructions on the direction of the market. And the same principles apply, don't they, to big companies, medium companies and small companies. What it boils down to, in my view, I think, is identifying your objectives, your ESG objectives and targets, and ensuring that you properly support those, that you substantiate those using the materials which we've covered so far. So the task force report on the revised strategy, the stewardship expectations, and the government governance guidance when it comes, as well as implementing measures which will help to incentivize those who have responsibility in a company for the direction of travel to achieve the ESG target. So if you can align your ESG objectives with remuneration of senior management of board members. That may improve the process, that may improve your progress towards achieving these goals. Just before I finish, because I can see you want me to finish, I know you well enough, there is no expectation that the small and medium-sized companies are tomorrow or in the next 6 months going to have perfect ESG compliance, but there is definitely an expectation that they should be able to demonstrate in 2 or 3 years pretty efficient progress towards ESG, complying with the ESG performance targets.
Great. Now, I wasn't hoping you would finish, James. I was actually spurred on by something you said there, which I think is a really important point, which is often overlooked, which is rather than just rush to do something, it's really important for an organisation to work out what it wants to achieve, so what it realistically can achieve. And it's that point about, decide where you want to end up and then work to get there, rather than just sort of get the ball rolling and hope for the best. So I think that was the point that piqued my interest in what you were saying there. So with that in mind, if you're sitting down to develop an ESG framework now, give us, I'll stick with you on this, James, give us 3 or 4 basic first steps you should be taking if you're going to put that framework in place.
Well, the steps I'll give you are all contingent upon what you've just highlighted, Paul. There is a massive vulnerability to a company which identifies very ambitious objectives and then falls short of those objectives. Because if it does so, then the regulators are going to get interested. There's going to be all sorts of concerns around misrepresentation to stakeholders and so forth. So the first point I would stress is identify what are your competitors doing? Have a look at the industry benchmarks and work to identify which ones are appropriate for your company.
And that's about being realistic, isn't it? That's not about just following the crowd. That's about saying, what do others believe is achievable, and therefore that may be achievable for us too.
Exactly. And where can you see your company fitting in to those industry standards? Once you've done that, of course, flowing from that is putting in place appropriate policies and procedures to support those business objectives. And this could be just coming back to the remuneration point about aligning your objectives to senior management remuneration. This could be about implementing a remuneration policy which incorporates ESG goals. So you're aligning executive compensation packages to short and long-term progress towards ESG. Thirdly is training. So educating, informing and incentivizing your employees on how they can help the company at large achieve those targets. And this can be anything really. I mean, it depends on the company. It has to be a bit bespoke package, but it could be anything from helping people to manage their well-being, working with charities, engaging with the community, raising awareness in the organization of what people can do individually and as part of the company to improve the ESG metrics. And finally, record and monitor, because there's no point in having these ambitious, imaginative objectives if you haven't set out those objectives and how you're reaching them. You need to be able to show your progress.
Okay, great. So Katie, the most difficult question I'm leaving for you now for the end. And it does resonate partly with what's happening in Glasgow right now in the discussions that we're seeing now in terms of developed major economies and emerging economies and this journey towards net zero and commitments on that. So it's on ESG and ESG compliance or ESG commitments. And it's that old discussion of, can these commitments towards positive goods like environmental goals, that the holistic social and corporate governance piece we've not covered today, but things like ensuring that you have a really healthy supply chain, an ethical, moral supply chain, all of the things that ESG could incorporate here. Can a sort of high performance or good performance on ESG, can that be aligned with the maximum or the best commercial performance of the business? Can they coexist, or is there always going to be a trade between one and the other?
I think they absolutely do coexist, and I actually think the ESG compliance is a really positive thing when you're then looking at it against your commercial goals. You know, if a company is able to demonstrate stronger ESG performance, certainly now, and you know, given the approach that you highlighted at the start, Paul, with BlackRock and other investors, you know, strong ESG performance is ultimately going to make a company much more attractive to investors if they're looking for investment, looking for funds. And I think on a smaller level, or you know, a more operational level, stronger ESG performance is going to make an entity much more attractive when it comes to applying for licenses or, you know, bidding for tenders, and it'll ultimately make you a much more attractive business partner. So, you know, from both an investment and from an operational point of view, I think ESG can only support your commercial goals, or perhaps not only. I think it would be slightly naive to not appreciate the fact that there are, you know, commercial costs associated with ESG compliance, but you know, I think it's probably, well, I certainly think it's on balance definitely worth the cost. You know, for example, if you or your business makes an ESG commitment to reduce or to avoid any instances of bribery, corruption, modern slavery within the supply chain, you know, that obviously has an impact where you're operating in higher risk jurisdictions. I know, for example, a lot of our clients have operations in West Africa, just as an example, where there are, you know, higher ABC concerns, higher labour concerns, and you know, in terms of the commercial cost, you know, balancing off against ESG, you might have to invest in enhanced due diligence processes. You might have to invest in, you know, higher risk management procedures, and also, you know, perhaps, you know, place someone in the region who is responsible for supply chain compliance that you might otherwise not have done, but for your ESG commitment. But I think especially in, you know, in the position we're in now with COP26 and the overall focus on achieving net zero, and the, you know, the heightened awareness actually of, you know, employee well-being, I think especially the last 18 months it's been brought, you know, to the surface. I think ESG going forward is certainly in line with the commercial goals that this industry has.
Great. There's one thing I wanted, really helpful. There was one thing I wanted to flag. An article, recent article, again, BlackRock's former head of investment was making the point, and we'll include this in the details we circulate after the call. And there's a nice sort of analogy which I'm going to adapt a little bit for us today. So this was an American analogy of talking about basketball and thinking about the fact that for years, when you're playing basketball, there's an element of dirty play that helps you succeed here. And so the comparison was, well, there'll always need to be a compromise on ESG and other ethical commitments to maximize commercial gain. And so that was the point being made by the person sort of calling into question the extent to which these two things could coexist. And now we could then, to put this in a UK context, you could change basketball for rugby, couldn't you, I suppose? And you could say there's always been an element of what happens in a scrum that we don't know about, etc. Now then, if everyone on the call can bear with me, because I can see interest waning as I carry on with this metaphor. But if you think about it in terms of the approach of regulators, as regulators come to crack down more and be more specific about what they require on ESG, it's a bit like the equivalent of the referee or the umpire deciding that they are going to penalise. So the dirty play or the things that were done previously to maximise commercial gain, those options are going to be increasingly taken away from you because regulators are going to not allow you that space to move. So I agreed with what you were saying, Katie. I just thought that basketball rugby analogy sort of helped people understand that the choice here is going to be increasingly taken away from you as regulators become more serious on this. Now, coming to the end, I've tried to cover questions from the audience as we've gone along and fold those in. So I just thought one question I haven't dealt with, which is left, and I thought it'd be useful to hear, Katie, probably from you on this, because you're sitting in Aberdeen with this right in front of you. We're interested in the questions: have you come across any successful or attractive ESG initiatives in the energy sector in the Northeast? So what are you seeing on the ground in terms of, it doesn't have to be the sort of highfalutin, ambitious ESG initiatives. What are you seeing working in Aberdeen right now?
I think, generally speaking, through the last 18 months through COVID, oil and gas companies up here certainly have really stepped up and supported the local community in terms of, funding food banks, donating to charities, and it's been, really reassuring to see actually the investment in the Northeast these companies have. I think specifically GE, who are based up here, they helped to refurbish the kitchen and dining area with a homeless hostel for the Sir Etienne's charity, and that was done via some of their employees volunteering to help with the renovations. ConocoPhillips as well, they're planting trees in support of forest rehabilitation, and I think it's essentially to offset their carbon footprint that they view by planting trees, and acting in that way, it helps to offset some of the CO2 that they produce from their operations. And they're also conducting research or funding research on species behaviour, seasonal habitats, and also establishing forest vegetation. And that's been done across all the areas that they operate in the last year. I think it would be silly for today, given the mention of CCS projects, not to mention Pale Blue Dot, who are working with Harbour Energy and Shell in and around the Acorn project, which is brilliant, and I'm sure that will continue to develop over the coming years. And also Neo Energy, as my final highlight, has committed £500,000 to support earth science learning in schools in the UK, and that's being done via a project that was developed by the University of St Andrews called GeoBus, and it's helping lots of schools across Scotland and the rest of the UK with earth science learnings.
Great. Good. Well, good. I really wanted to end on some positives and some good stories. That's excellent to get those in, and thanks for that question, which allows us to crowbar those relevant stories in. I'm going to draw the session to an end now. I wanted to thank Katie and James for their really important contributions and the insight they've given the audience today. I also wanted to thank everyone for joining the session, and a broad thanks. We've done a number of ESG events. We've tried to focus on relevant sectors. We really appreciate the feedback and the support we're getting from the sectors, because we think it's a really important challenge for a number of sectors going forward, energy at the heart of that. So thanks all for joining the session this morning. If there's something that you wanted to hear covered that wasn't covered, please feed that back to us. If you've got particular questions, please let us know. If you're interested more in ESG, do look at our website content. There's a lot up there. Also look at some of our writings for OGA Energy. In the last, or some recent issues, you'll see a lot of ESG related writing from us there if you're hungry for ESG content. So it's all there for you if you want to take that away from today. So that's all I wanted to say to close. Thanks all for attending, and goodbye from James, from Katie, and from me. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.